Good evening, loyal listeners, and welcome to Wilhelm Presents Frightening Tales and Other Weird Stories. I'm your host, Wilhelm, and each week I invite you to dim the lights and settle in as we explore a dark and unsettling tale of the paranormal. Stories conjured by authors from all over this world. If you dare to share a fiction of your own, submit it at frighteningtales.com. And should you find yourself still hungry, there's more than 120 previous episodes awaiting you, patiently in the dark. Today's tale is written by U.S. writer Asher Ellis, whose previously published works include his novel, The Remedy, published by Fathom 5, which Bram Stoker Award winner Brian Keene describes as the cure for the trite, too familiar trappings infecting the horror genre. It was re-released by Deadite Press in 2023, along with his never-before-published sequel, The Therapy. Other novels include Curse of the PIGMAN and Pet, both re-released via Crossroad Press. His book, Highjack, was recently re-released by Crystal Lake Publishing. Among his published science fiction is the story Expertise, which appeared in the Bram Stoker-nominated anthology Worst Laid Plans from Grindhouse Press. His most recent short story publication can be found in the upcoming audio presentation of Humor Theory on the Tales to Terrify podcast. As if that wasn't enough, Asher has also written award-winning short films, including Exit 7A, which was included in the feature-length horror anthologies The Portal and Conjure X, both available on Tubi streaming app. His penned short film, My Name is Art, was featured in Amazon's first annual All Voices Film Festival, celebrating underrepresented communities. And now, let's dive into this Friday's tale he calls The Sandbar. Carlo stared out towards the horizon, the ocean and sky tinted orange by the lenses of his polarized sunglasses. Although the eyewear protected him from the harsh noon sky above the speeding yacht, he noticed his vision was impaired by scattered spots of water that had splashed onto his face. Removing the glasses with one hand while he continued to steer with the other, Carlo discovered it was not the sea that speckled his lenses. It was blood. Raoul! Carlo shouted over the roar of the boat's dual engines. A few seconds later, his South American companion emerged from the vessel's hull. "Get me a rag or something. I've got the captain's blood on my shades." Raoul grinned and returned down the stairs into the ship's living quarters. Apparently, he thought that was funny. But then again, there were few things that the Peruvian pirate didn't find amusing. Even when they boarded the yacht, demanded the skipper open the safe, and then slashed both his throat and that of the little blonde arm candy accompanying him. Raoul had laughed the whole time. Carlo couldn't help but admit it was somewhat unnerving. But despite a slight lack of trust, it was still a good partnership. Raoul's unstable viciousness paired quite well with Carlo's clear logic. The brains and the blade, no better match. Though, at the moment, Carlo found himself failing to do his part as he squinted against the blinding reflection of the sun and saw only water in all directions. Their fuel supply was dangerously low, as were his ideas of what to do next. Raoul sprang up the stairs and handed him a towel. "So, amigo, how we looking?" Carlo grabbed the towel and proceeded to wipe the lenses clean. Once he finished, he answered, "Well, compadre, we are about to run out of gas, and since you put a bullet in the GPS, I have absolutely no idea where the hell we are." Raoul hissed, "That was an accident. I was just trying to scare them." Carlo stared down at the busted piece of technology, a bullet hole in its broken facade. Anger surged through his nerves, and he whipped the towel back in Raoul's face. "Next time, fire a shot up into the air. Up, above you, up!" Raoul grimaced as Carlo shoved past him. "Take the wheel. I'm going below to look for a map. I can't find one up here." Raoul mumbled something that Carlo couldn't hear, but he didn't ask to have it repeated. What was done, and if they wanted to avoid having to board the dinghy, Carlo was going to have to keep a straight head. The cocky young asshole who had owned this expensive seacraft must have had enough sense to keep a map somewhere on board. Carlo had just begun to search his first cabinet when he spotted something in his peripheral vision. The bedroom was to his right, and its door had been left open. The bed, unmade. Its sheets and blankets were tangled in a messy pile, the result of Raoul and Carlo's assault when they had caught their victims off guard during a session of lovemaking. The linens covered the entire mattress, except for the bottom left corner, where a bare foot was sticking out. A female foot. "Raoul!" Carlo screamed as he bolted back up the stairs, finding his partner opening a fresh Corona instead of steering the boat. "Hey, muchacho!" Raoul bellowed while reaching for a lime wedge out of an onboard cooler. "You want one?" Carlo ignored the question. "I thought I told you to throw the bodies over the side." Raoul took a swig. "I got rid of the hombre." "And the woman?" Carlo pointed behind him, towards the hull. Raoul looked that direction and flashed his trademark smile. "I figured, why throw away trash while it still has some use, you know?" In that instant, logic and reasoning ceased to exist to Carlo Romano. Pure, unfiltered rage consumed his very being as he reached out and grabbed the collars of Raoul's unbuttoned Hawaiian shirt. "Listen, you son of a bitch. Do you want somebody to find a dead naked girl on our boat? Do you want to get caught?" When I tell you to do something, you do it. Comprende? Raul batted Carlo's hands away and shoved him out of his face. Back off, pendejo. You just try that again and see what happens. I'll cut off your huevos and feed them to the fish if you touch me again. Raul's rant came to an abrupt halt. He stared past Carlo and squinted his eyes. Knowing that Raul wasn't smart enough to utilize a decoy, Carlo turned to see what had so suddenly grabbed his attention. A dark, jagged shape jutted up from the horizon. There was no mistaking it. Land. Carlo and Raul mirrored identical expressions of absolute glee. The argument was mutually forgotten, and the pair sprang into action. "That bitch is going overboard," Raul yelled, and leapt down the stairs. Carlo pressed down on the accelerator as far as he could go, watching the mass of mysterious land gain more definition as they drew closer. It wasn't long until the landmass took an identifiable form. A tropical island. Once Raul had disposed of the remaining body and wiped away any visible blood splatter, he joined Carlo at his side and stared ahead through a pair of binoculars. "Can you see anyone?" Carlo asked. Raul scanned from left to right. "There is no harbor, that's for sure. I don't see any people either." Carlo grabbed the binoculars and checked for himself. The island's beach did appear to be abandoned, but that did not mean there was no one behind the tree line. Other sailors could be docked on the island's opposite side, not to mention the possibility of indigenous peoples. But there was nothing to see from their vantage. So, Carlo went to hand the binoculars back to his partner. And that was when he spotted the Sandbar, standing about 500 feet off the island's coast, and had a great idea. The boat took a sudden turn to cause Raul to stumble and drop his beer. "Are you loco, man? Where are you going?" Carlo raised the accelerator, quieting the engine so that he would no longer have to shout. "We don't know if there's anyone on that island. If there are, they could be friendly, or they could be just like us. Either way, I don't want to get caught with my pants down if they decide they'd like to take us from the fortune we've downright earned." Carlo nodded his head towards the metal box they had retrieved from the yacht's safe. Raul picked a piece of lime pulp from his teeth. "So, what are we doing?" For once, Carlo smiled when Raul did not. "Before we go to the island, we're gonna bury our treasure in the Sandbar." The yacht had been anchored and the dinghy driven until it bottomed out in the shallow waters that surrounded the Sandbar. The two men carried the steel case to the center of the shoal, which turned out to be much larger than it had appeared at a distance. Raul began digging a large hole, while Carlo kept a close eye on the island as he worked. They had yet to see any signs of humanity. Once Raul became fatigued, Carlo took over and finished digging the hole. The whole process had taken them a little more than an hour. Carlo now stood in the pit, squinting as he looked up at his partner. "Okay, that's deep enough. Hand me the box." Raul vanished out of sight for a moment and then reappeared with the case. "This seems like a lot of trouble for nothing," Raul spoke as he passed the chest down to Carlo. "I mean, I've been looking at the island ever since you took over digging, and I have seen nada, man. Nothing at all." Carlo grabbed the case and placed it on the floor of the freshly dug grave. Raul was right about one thing. It had been a lot of work. The beads of perspiration that rolled down his brow were proof enough of that. But they would be glad they suffered through a little manual labor if they reached the mainland and things did turn sour. "This may turn out to be pointless, Raul," Carlo said as he dug his fingers into the ground above him and prepared to hoist himself up. "But you know what they say, better safe than..." The remaining word of Carlo's sentence failed to escape his lips when he saw what stood right behind Raul. A man, completely covered with sand from head to toe, and somehow snuck up on his partner and was raising his arms above his head. "Raul, behind you!" Raul spun to face his assailant, confusion distorting his face like a Picasso painting. The stranger's eyes drooped, like they were sliding down to meet his nose. A constant trickle of sand endlessly drooled over his open mouth. Raul shouted, his voice a combination of anger and concern. "Hey, back off, man!" When the mysterious new arrival ignored Raul's demand, Raul extended both of his palms to shove the man away. And his hands disappeared into the man's chest. For a single breath's moment, the two men stood silently in an awkward embrace, Raul staring down at his submerged wrists in utter disbelief. And from somewhere above, a seagull released its signature squawk, and Raul screamed, "Dios mío!" He tried to retrieve his hands from the sandy body, but they would not budge an inch. Locked in a defenseless position, Raul could do nothing to stop his opponent from forcing his mouth open with one hand and jamming the other arm into his gaping maw. "No!" Carlo bawled, scrambling as fast as he could out of the hole. The man's arm continued to pour its way into Raul's oral cavity. Raul's eyes rolled up into his skull, his body convulsing in frantic spasms. By the time Carlo emerged from the pit, Raul had fallen limp, sand trickling out of his nose and the corners of his eyes like an overflowing hourglass. Carlo picked up the shovel and swung for the man's head, but instead of feeling a satisfying spray of warm blood, Carlo gasped for air when the head exploded into a cloud of sand.
that stung his eyes and invaded his lungs. Blinded and choking, Carlo staggered backwards, flailing the shovel with one hand in a pathetic attempt at self-defense. The other hand raked across his eyes as he tried to rub away the grit impeding his vision. Despite his tears, Carlo was able to regain his sight, but immediately wished he'd remained in ignorant darkness. The man's head had somehow grown back, and now grotesquely deformed like a partially dissolved sandcastle. The shovel fell to Carlo's feet. Paralyzing fear had claimed his entire body, his muscles betraying his mind's simple command to run away. He could only stand and watch as the creature shuffled towards him, until a searing pain ripped through the flesh of his right bicep. Carlo darted his head to see a second Sandman clutching his arm. The monster's grip burned hotter than a beach reflecting the midday sun, while jagged fragments of broken seashells tore at his skin. Carlo ripped his arm free from the grasping hand and darted past the assaulting sand creatures. As he sprinted for the dinghy, countless sandmen emerged from his right and left, arising from the ground like zombies struggling free from their rotten graves. But these monsters need not break the earth's surface and dig their way from the ground. They were the ground. That meant if Carlo could reach his vessel and cast off, he could put fathoms of water between himself and his predators. Carlo exhaled a sigh of relief when he approached the life-saving raft and choked on his own breath when he realized the tide had gone out, while he and Raoul had been digging the hole. To drag the heavy dinghy out of the water now would slow him down enough to seal his fate. But he could always swim. With the amount of adrenaline pumping through his system, the long distance to the yacht would feel like a lap around a pool. Carlo ran towards the sparkling blue ocean. Sand people emerged in his path, but he dodged them like a running back going for a touchdown. The cool water splashing his body as he dove headfirst was the best sensation Carlo had ever experienced. It did not last long. Now that he treaded water about 200 feet from the deadly sandbar, Carlo realized the boat was nowhere to be seen. "Where is it?" Carlo whispered, already beginning to feel the cramps of fatigue in his legs. It seemed he now had two disastrous options: return to the deadly sandbar, or eventually drown. Death by water, or death by land. Which would it be? A distinctly human voice shouted something behind him. Carlo kicked himself around and was met with the greatest sight in the world. 3 canoes quickly approaching. "Oh, over here!" Carlo yelled. And with all of his remaining strength, "Please, I need help." The canoes came close enough for Carlo to clearly see who rode them. They appeared to be natives of the island, their muscled arms glistening in the sunlight with each row. Dried paint decorated their faces and toned torsos. A strong hand reached down to meet Carlos. 2 other sets of arms helped ease him into the canoe. Carlo hit the floor of the raft, rolled onto his back, and tried to catch his breath. He closed his eyes to the bright sun above, its rays never feeling so warm. "Thank you," Carlo managed to say between gasps of air. You saved my life." He then carefully brought himself up, moving slowly to counter the dizziness that still remained. His saviors sat around him, 2 rowing on each end and 2 more kneeling beside him. Their lack of verbal response indicated they did not speak the same language. So Carlo nodded appreciatively and sat back to enjoy the rest of the trip to the safety of the island. An island that wasn't getting any closer, but rather passing them on their left. They were returning to the Sandbar. "Oh, wait!" Carlo shrieked. Don't go back there. They'll kill us." Carlo whipped his head around to see each of the tribesmen to see if anyone understood. That was when he began to notice the man-shaped tattoos on their shoulders and the matching necklaces that hung around their necks, sculpted out of what looked like dried mud. Something hard smacked the back of Carlo's head and everything became dark. Carlo awoke to find his wrists and ankles tied together. His waking disorientation did not last long, for there was no question as to where he was. The tribesmen had returned him to the Sandbar. Carlo rolled over onto his side and looked out at the ocean. The natives were still floating out there, their hands stretched to the sky, fingers shaking as if they were all suffering a severe seizure. One of the tribesmen, wearing a colorful headdress of red and yellow flowers, stood and shook a long staff as he led the others in chant. Behind him, the approaching sounds of the living sand were coming closer. It would not be long before the ritual sacrifice was complete. Carlo flipped onto his back and stared upward towards the cloudless azure sky. He wondered if his fate was a gift to their gods or a punishment from his.
Thank you, loyal listeners, for venturing into the dark with me tonight. Return next week for another tale lurking just beyond the veil. If you enjoyed your journey with me, support my work. Like, subscribe, rate, or leave a comment where possible. Any of it helps. Most of all, share frightening tales and support the authors who dared to dream these machinations. Until next time, when a new tale creeps across the airwaves, Listen closely if you're brave enough.